Well, thank you for including me in your Congress. I'm Dr. Ronald Weinstein, and I'm talking to you from Tucson, Arizona. And it's a great honor for me to be part of your Congress again. Ironically, a couple of days ago, we had a meeting in downtown Phoenix, Arizona, and Dr. Dale Alverson and Elizabeth Kaprinsky were the co-chairs of that Congress. And so it's nice to be together with them as well, albeit virtually. And before I begin going through the PowerPoint slides, I want to thank Francisco LaRosa for including me in this conference. That's very thoughtful. And I certainly wish that I could be there in person. Okay, what I'm going to do over the next 25 or 30 minutes is give a broad overview of telemedicine dating back to 1968. So this is a 50-year summary, and for me that's a celebration. And it's certainly a privilege in an academic career to actually get to see the development of a field from its very inception. So I'm going to talk about progress in telemedicine, give a little bit of history, since I think people find that interesting, and then do some updates on how to build successful telemedicine programs. And of course, I'm dealing with both telemedicine and telepathology in the course of this presentation. Very early on in telemedicine, early telemedicine was deeply rooted in the US space program. So NASA began developing space medicine in the 1950s, late 1950s. And as this became a reality, they also had an interest in taking that technology and putting it into terrestrial applications. And one of the first terrestrial applications was in Boston, although I don't think they ever really publicly identified that program with NASA. But the players in NASA, as we can see on the left of this logo, the red box, the partner was Lockheed Martin Space Company on the right, and they helped actually design the facility at the Massachusetts General Hospital and at the Logan International Airport that really became the first multi-specialty telemedicine program. There had been earlier telepsychiatry and teleradiology programs which were standalones. So the first program at Harvard and the Massachusetts General Hospital was run by Dr. Kenneth Bird, being shown here in 1968, right at the very beginning of their implementation of cases. And I actually knew Dr. Bird, with me being a resident in pathology at the time, who had the very good fortune of being drawn into this program. So the original program involved connecting the Massachusetts General Hospital on the left to the Logan International Airport. And this was a distance of about 4 miles, and the connection was by microwave. The program was a walk-in clinic at Gate 23 at the Logan Airport, which became very famous. And patients who felt ill in transit through air or workers at the airport, of which there were about 6,000, could utilize this facility even for their annual checkups. This was what was thought to be a portable camera at that time, and you can see how the nurse was outfitted at the time that I would have been a resident there. And this shows Dr. Bird connecting to a patient out at the airport. Notice that he actually has earplugs, and he's actually listening through an electronic stethoscope, very much as we would do it today, 50 years later. Okay, well, let's move to Arizona 4 years later. And with the success of that project, which itself went on for almost a decade, NASA decided that they wanted to show how telemedicine worked on a much larger scale, and decided to do it on an Indian reservation that actually touches upon Tucson. So Tucson, and at that time a new medical school, were very, very involved. And one reason for selecting it is that the hospital in Tucson, which became our University Medical Center, the hospital was the first hospital in the country to attempt to go paperless. So that's an interesting historical point. Now, of course, one reason we're doing it in Arizona is that it's a very, very large state. Arizona is about the size of Germany, but whereas Arizona has a population of almost 7 million, Germany has a population of 83 million. So a much denser population in Germany. So very large spaces were problematic, and that made Arizona an attractive place. And also our Indian reservations were very attractive since they're all on what's regarded as federal land. So this is the northern part of Arizona, where we do a lot of telemedicine. This is a diagram of what the original configuration is. It involved the computer center, which was at Tucson Medical Center, or University Medical Center. A very large, the largest of the Indian Health Service hospitals. This is in Phoenix. It involved mobile clinics. It involved small rural clinics. It involved an extensive microwave telecommunication system. Here we can see they've chopped off at the top of the mountain to make it flat so that they could have this relay station up there. So this was very large, very elaborate, and very expensive. And it cost about $6 million per year in 1972 dollars. I can't calculate what that would be now. Mike, what would that be now? Probably 100 million. Okay, our chief engineer says 100 million. I think that might be on the high side, but it was a lot of money one way or the other. So anyway, this was a very expensive deal. They did some very, very sophisticated things. Here you can see NASA, Indian Health Service, and Lockheed. You can also see that the program only lasted for 3 years because the federal government decided not to continue it, and that was actually very, very disruptive to the tribes. So this is the original logo for that project. Again, NASA and Lockheed Martin Space Company, Indian Health Service, and the Indian reservation at that time was called the Papago Indian tribe, and the project was called StarPac. And here we can see in one of the mobile vehicles, we can see a television camera, and here a family, parents are discussing a pediatric case with one of the local providers, who was then hooking them in to a pediatric cardiologist at another location. And this camera was very, very similar, if not identical, to one that had been used at the Massachusetts General Hospital. Well, time flies. That was in 1972. This is in 2012 in Tucson at a meeting that we held at the College of Medicine, at which we honored the people from the original project. And this was 40 years later. This was the 40th anniversary. And we had the great pleasure. Unfortunately, all of the primary people were still alive, and we could have a very, very informative celebratory anniversary celebration. And they had really done it all. They had done all of the things that had been done at the Mass General, but on a much larger scale. And here's the original medical director for the original project. He was in his late 20s at the time that he had actually participated in StarPac. Well, United States telemedicine. United States telemedicine, ironically, as done in Arizona, actually came out of an international program. So in 1992, I had relocated a couple of times and found myself as a head of pathology at the medical school in Tucson. And this was in 1992, and we decided to do an international trial, clinical trial, on patients using static image telepathology. And this was the day we started it, June 1992. So it's almost exactly 25 years ago. And so this was the original group, and this was in Hermosillo, Mexico, which is about 4 hours to the south of Tucson. Tucson's very close to the border. And for years, the pathologists down in Hermosillo brought their difficult cases up to the medical school for second opinions. And they were delighted to link in by video. So this really started our involvement in the rebirth of telemedicine in Arizona. And at the same time, the Department of Radiology was starting their program. So that was the basis, an original program, basis for us, a program that involved Mexico and also China, plus some sites in Arizona. Our state legislature decided to fund an Arizona telemedicine program 4 years later, and this is the logo. And since then, our engineers, including Mike Holcomb, have developed a very large network. So we have about 170, 160 sites in 70 communities around Arizona and several beyond the borders. We're very involved in training. We have many, many training sessions. We've had almost 2,000 individuals have gone through our training programs. So that functions as a state resource. And here is Janet Major, who's one of our staff people demonstrating an otoscope. Here, similar equipment is being demonstrated at the White House. So the current president and the head of the National Department of Veterans Affairs, and the president is talking to, who is in Washington, D.C., at the White House, is talking to a patient, a teledermatology patient who's on the other coast, who's in Oregon. So this is what a modern setup for telemedicine would look like. We use video conferencing today routinely, just using the same service that's enabling me to talk to you. In this case, we're using the carrier is called Zoom.us, and it's become commonplace. Many specialties are done in telemedicine today. A few of them are listed on this poster. So looking through an otoscope at a ruptured membrane. Correctional telemedicine is a big deal in some parts of the United States. Here's a lesion on a lip. That's pretty difficult to see, but it's seen very nicely with the cameras that we use. Teledentistry is used particularly in our prisons. Radiology has always been the #1 application of telemedicine in general. Our institution alone has done over 1.3 million cases into 25 hospitals. Today it's at 85% of hospitals in the United States, which is the total number would be about 5,500 hospitals. About 85% of hospitals use teleradiology, at least for some of their activities. This slide, oh, here we go. Teleophthalmology is a very good application. And then there are more specialized applications. This is teleechocardiography that one of our pediatricians is talking to a neonatologist in a hospital about 300 miles away in a neonatal intensive care unit. And that practice has been going on for years and involved hundreds and hundreds of cases. Pediatrics is a very nice application. One rarely finds a pediatrician in our rural communities, so this becomes a really important linkage in many areas in the United States. Okay, so we've had quite an experience. We kind of started, starting with international in our case, and then moving to rural, and now moving to urban. And I'd like to show a couple of slides dealing with what are success factors. Now, our program's been around a long time, but we've also gotten to know quite a few other programs. There's a national network of telehealth resource centers, and I and Dr. Kaprinsky are very much a part of that activity. So we really get to see what goes on throughout the United States, and I think there are a couple of generalizations that we could make at this time. First of all, of the 60 or 70 applications that would be regarded as reasonably common in the telemedicine / telehealth world, there are 3 areas that are particularly likely to succeed, particularly as first applications within new programs. And the first of all would be gap services, teleradiology, telepathology, gap services for rural hospitals in particular. And those patients are frequently going to be patients who are in motor accidents. And for example, the patient who needs a cervical CT scan, and the issue is whether the patient has a broken neck and needs to be air-vacked a couple of 100 miles to a large metropolitan area. So gap services, gap in the sense that before telemedicine, a radiologist would be a journeyman and might come to a hospital every 3 or 4 days, or perhaps once a week, or perhaps even once every 2 weeks in a very, very rural setting. And so the gap is the gap between when they come to that hospital. In the case of pathology, the gap service would be frozen sections at rural hospitals. And there are many rural hospitals that really can stay open because they can get telepathology services that enable them to keep a surgeon at that hospital, with that surgeon doing operations that really require, or best of services would require having somebody available to do frozen sections. And we could give many examples of frozen sections being done by telepathology really around the world. So gap services are important. Urgent services are very, very important. And in the United States, a quote-unquote killer application is a term we use for things that are very, very important applications, a little bit of slang of the English language. But the one that comes to mind particularly is telestroke. We now know that patients who are going to develop ischemic strokes, as opposed to hemorrhagic strokes, can be treated with clot-busting drugs such as TPA. And in order to do intravenous infusions of TPA to break clots, say in the carotid arteries, in order to do that, you really have to initiate that within what's called the golden hour, although it actually refers to the first 3 hours. And beyond that, the drug becomes progressively much less effective. And it's been shown by vascular neurologists that using TPA probably is effective in 90% of cases where the patients have what is classified as an ischemic stroke. And about 7/8 of strokes are ischemic strokes. So that's very exciting, and that's really brought that therapy mainstream in the United States. And there are even areas in the United States where treating with TPA is regarded as a standard of care. So that's important. Teletrauma is an urgent service, much more difficult to do, to organize and make work. We've had some, I would say, limited successes, particularly at one hospital. And part of the problem there is that even though it's very effective to set up a camera looking at an emergency room, and the person looking at that, we would call it telepresence. They're viewing what's going on and helping the local physicians get through cases. They're very busy. Typically, those are what we call level 1 trauma centers, and those docs are just fantastically busy all day and all night long. So to get them to break from what they're doing and actually do this usually takes a trauma surgeon who has a personal interest in doing that service. So even though teletrauma can be very, very effective and can certainly save lives in certain cases, it's not widely utilized. Now, a lot of people are working on putting video cameras on ambulances. We've certainly done that experiment. But again, the value of doing it remains to be seen. So far, it's on the back burner. But telestroke is for real. And telestroke, I would regard as a standard of care in many clinical settings. And then in the United States, we have mandated services. And there's a requirement by the United States Supreme Court that prisoners, incarcerated prisoners, have a right to medical services. And to deprive them of those services is regarded as what is called cruel and unusual punishment. So telemedicine, there's an entire industry involving private, as we call it, privatization of prison health care and the use of telemedicine. But the amount that it's used is very, very variable from even prison to prison within a given state in the United States. So correctional telemedicine, also telepsychiatry, can be a mandated service. In the United States, to do an involuntary institutionalization of a patient with mental health issues, typically a dangerous patient or a patient who's dangerous to themselves. In order to do that requires an opinion of 2 psychiatrists. And, you know, it'd be unlikely to have 1 psychiatrist in one of our rural communities, let alone 2. So those opinions, first opinion and second opinion, can be done by telepsychiatry with a high level of success. Now, in the United States, looking at that, you know, 50-year or 25 or 10-year time frame, why do so many telehealth programs fail? And there is a high failure rate. For a long time, there was a program in California that funded about $6 million worth of new telemedicine programs each year. And for those programs 5 years later, you know, 90% or more of them would have disappeared. And so very, very high failure rate early on in telemedicine. And what would be some of those root causes? And we can base this part of the story based on our own experience, which now involves hundreds of programs through the years. Well, one thing is demonstration programs, what are called demonstration projects, some seed money to start a program and demonstrate it to a medical staff. Those things rarely work. They get funded, there's a champion. They look at some cases, but they don't have a sustainable business plan. They often don't really have buy-in by a medical staff. They don't necessarily make it part of their routine. And therefore, those projects almost always fail, even though they're very popular. And people, particularly at academic medical centers, have a great urge to put their toe in the water. Startup funds, when programs are started with just startup funds and then no continuation funding at the very beginning, they usually fail. Unless telemedicine is bought into by the leadership, by the chief executive officer, by the director of a hospital, with a recognized need for it as part of how that organization wants to improve its quality of its services or scope of its services or the size of its services, if they have ideas to expand their medical center, that has to be built in from the very beginning. And as we see, the chief executive officer, chief financial officer, chief information officer, we refer to that as the C-suite. If the buy-in is not in the C-suite, the program will likely fail over time. Weak business plans. If it doesn't make sense financially, it probably isn't going to work. Even in environments that are not really businesses, but are really public service types of entities. And specialty disincentives. There are certain specialties, medical specialties, in which the doctors are very unlikely to want to do telemedicine. Orthopedic surgery would be one example. Well, to make the diagnosis, but then not to have the patient come in to get surgery, that's a disincentive. Even in the case of telestroke, giving that drug can be a disincentive because basically the telemedicine component is the diagnostic part to actually look at the CAT scans or the MRIs and also to do a remote physical diagnosis of the patient in order to say, yes, this person has the beginning of a stroke, but then not to actually give the TPA. That's a real problem because the majority of the money from our insurers or our federal insurers or state insurers actually is going to the site where the TPA is infused. So the people who are making the diagnosis aren't going to get the lion's share of the revenue, of the remuneration, and that's a disincentive. Telemedicine and telepathology, they're not easy. They're harder than hands-on practice. Now that may change over time, and that may change over time because there may be modifications of what routine diagnostic algorithms are. We're seeing that particularly in Parkinson's disease. But there is a complexity. There's an intermediate layer. You have the telecommunications layer. Often we require a case presenter other than the physician or the practicing nurse where the patient is located. We need case aggregators where the telemedicine cases are being read out. This is adding personnel. In other words, there are additional steps being added which add to the complexity. Collaborator mismatches, the people who are making the diagnosis and the people who are sending the cases in, and the specialists who might tend to the patient may be mismatches. They may be in different practices. They may even have different philosophies on how best to treat patients. So those kinds of mismatches are important. And then program champions. People lead programs, you know, guilty, I do that. But we do that with a special kind of energy, one might say, and a certain level of enthusiasm that may be above average. And it's very, very hard to pass that on to a next generation, in part because it's just, there's a special thrill that comes with starting things, and the next person doesn't get to do that. It's like academic departments. It's actually difficult to turn the leadership over to a next chairman. We do it, but there's a certain, there's something that's lost. So program champions, there are a lot of programs that have started and really look good, and then, you know, somebody turns out and then there's a successor and it doesn't work the way it did. So program champions are something to keep an eye on in terms of sustainability of programs. Okay. Okay, the final thing I want to say about this part is, before I'm talking a little bit more about international programs, is that there's an entire new wave of services in telemedicine which are actually going to dominate the marketplace. So the traditional kinds of telemedicine that we did will continue, but in terms of numbers of cases per year, it'll be swamped. It'll be flooded by a new kind of a new business plan, and this we refer to as on-demand services. And these are services where patients directly contact the telephysician or the telenurse and buy their services, usually at a set dollar amount per session, and often with a set amount of time. The interaction may be 5 minutes, 10 minutes, often 15 minutes. So we have a patient who's pulling up a menu from a company, Teladoc, American Well. In the United States, would be about 400 or 500 of those companies. And they tap on the icon or the picture of the physician, and the physician, and a form pops up on the screen which the patient checks off boxes as part of their history, and then the physical takes place. And the provider pops up on the screen. And generally, these services will handle 15 to 21 common diseases, patients with earaches or strep throats, those sorts of things. And the doctors can actually write prescriptions so that the patient can then go to a pharmacy and get the drugs. And so, and in part, the patient is conducting a self-exam. So, for example, they might put a special gadget on their smartphone and pop it into their ear and do an otoscopic examination. Can even participate in doing a 1 lead or 2 lead or 12 lead electrocardiogram. That can be done at a distance. And so these are on-demand companies. These companies are being very effective in marketing their services. For the startup companies, they've been very effective in raising startup money. It's estimated, one estimate 2 years ago was that $280 million was invested in a single year in these startup companies. And I put down at the bottom, it's agnostic telemedicine and telehealth. Agnostic in the sense that the identity of the doctor, I mean, they know the name, but they don't actually know anything about the doctor. The doctor's basically agnostic, and they're quite interchangeable. So whoever is on duty may be assigned to that case. And very, very agnostic. How big are these practices? They've gotten very large. There are companies in the United States that have 3,000 to 5,000 doctors on call, and that 3,000 to 5,000 doctors may be doing all of that from an office in their homes, a virtual office in their homes. So that's a relatively new phenomenon. Now that's taken telemedicine out to the general public, and of course they're very interested in participating. And what we're seeing is number one, state laws that require reimbursement of these folks, these service providers. There are new laws that are helping with interstate medical licensure, which is always a barrier to distant practice in the United States. There are laws that are requiring third-party payers, insurance companies, to pay for those services. And those types of laws are also spreading quite rapidly across the United States. Over 30 state legislators have examined that, and I think within a year or two, either be a non-issue because the insurance companies are just going to pay for it, or it'll be because there are laws in every state that make that happen. So that's a very interesting phenomenon. Brand new, facilitated by technology, and working well. And from my perspective as a physician, I would say, yeah, it's very likely that 85, 86% of patients can be handled very nicely by on-demand telemedicine. So keep your eye on that. If it's not already existent in your country, it probably will be sooner than later. Now, I'd like to say a few things, since this is an international meeting, a few things about international telemedicine, both historical and contemporary. Our program has done a lot of international telemedicine. Some of it's been through the Arizona Telemedicine Program. Some of it's been through our Department of Surgery. But projects have been done in many parts of the world. I think that in our own case, we've done a lot of stuff with Dr. Rifat Latifi in the Balkans. We've done things in China. We've done things in India. The first of our programs in Latin America was in Panama, and many of you have heard presentations on that before, since members of your organization were central to those programs. So just a couple of pictures as reminders. Here we have a circle at in Panama, in a very mountainous region, on several of the Indian reservations. Here are the planning of the program. You can see Dr. Vega with the blue necktie talking to the Minister of Health in Panama City about the program. We think it's very, very important to start at the level of the president or the Minister of Health in creating these programs rather than a bottoms-up approach. An air view showing San Felix, which was the hub site, and then several sites where we had telemedicine clinics way up in mountains. And here we can see the highway, or the road that led to those sites. And of course, this became pretty impassable during particularly the rainy seasons. A typical remote site. Distance wasn't very great, 8 kilometers, but the road was virtually impassable for at least part of the year. So a site that one of multiple sites that were implemented. A lot of this was funded through the U.S. Army at that time. The clinic had no doctor, no nurse on site. Often it was a nurse's assistant who presented the case, or a medical intern, often who had received their medical degree in Cuba. So real accessibility issues. The Army elected, so this program started around 2000. We used video phones because that's what the U.S. Army was interested in trying out, and what we learned is that they worked very, very well. Presentation of some cases from Cerro Iglesias, which was one of the rural sites, to the San Felix Hospital, which was regarded as the hub site, and listening to a patient's breath sounds and heart and so forth. A consulting site in San Felix, which was a 27-bed hospital. Something that's not mentioned here is that San Felix became part of the first PACS system that was implemented in Latin America. So large radiology system grew out of this U.S. Army implementation in partnership with the Ministry of Health in Panama. This was the consulting room at San Felix, and you can see the instructions on the wall, and we made it very, very easy for both the sending doctors, the referring doctors, and the consultants to examine the cases, and the monitor is linked by a cable to the video phone, so we can see a very enlarged version of what's on the video screen on this large monitor. And that system worked very well. And the program ran for a number of years and benefited thousands of patients from the Indian reservations, just like the early users were in the United States. This was a very high-profile program. Here's Panama President Martin Trujillo coming and San Felix and talking to the Dr. Rosamina, who was out at one of the rural sites in the lower left-hand picture, and the president appearing very, I don't know what he's thinking about, but he sounds very, what do you think, Michael? It sounds like he's very ecstatic. Maybe his mother, like my mother, wanted him to be a doctor. Who knows? But anyway, he looks really happy, day in the sun. And what happened to that program? Well, in 2009, change in direction in the United States when we had a new president, Barack Obama. And what happened, to make a long story short, what happened is a number of our sites were picked up by the Lopez Family Foundation. And the Lopez Family Foundation had actually started a program in Puerto Rico in 2010, and then moved into the sites as we vacated them in Panama and began providing services. And now what's called the Lopez Family Foundation now has sites, I understand it, in a number of different countries in Latin America. So telemedicine became their large focus. So our program was very involved during the first 8 or 9 years of the Panamanian National Program. And then other groups came in and partnered, and I'm told that a number of those sites are still very successful. So that's my story. What I've summarized is kind of a 50-year overview. I think what's interesting to me is telemedicine as it's done today is remarkably similar as to the way it was done originally. Same services, same results. There was a major book on telemedicine published in 1975 that extensively described both STAR-PEC clinical results and the Mass General results. In other words, it's a technology that was born whole. A technology worked from the beginning, but the implementation took a long time. Legal and regulatory and reimbursement issues, and selling it to the medical professions and showing the value. All are components that came into play in determining its ultimate success, as just described to you by Elizabeth Kaprinsky and Dale, that as telemedicine moves center stage. So thank you very much for the honor of talking to your group. Have a good meeting.